Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. My name is Andy Pushlik. I'm a partner in the Toronto Labour and Employment Group and also the national leader of the Dentons Canada Employment and Labour Group. And I'm also going to be your moderator today. Today's presentation is focused on the brave new world that we find ourselves in with ChatGPT and generative AI. And so I'm really happy to be joined by my colleagues, Kirsten Thompson, who's a partner in the Toronto office and the national leader of our Dentons Privacy and Cybersecurity Group, as well as our colleague, Luca Lucarini, who is an associate in the Dentons Privacy and Cybersecurity Group. So last month, we were talking about kind of those traditional labor and employment matters. We talked about some just cause issues, the deductibility of the CERB, and a few different employment law cases in Quebec and Ontario and some of the other provinces. Like I said, today we're focused on the brave new world, and in particular, ChatGPT and generative AI. This has been something that has been in the news really since the end of last year is when things really started to take fire, when we started to learn about what was ChatGPT and just the power that this machine or robot had and how it could potentially take over the workforce and workplace, and what did that mean for the law? What did that mean for our workforces, and what did that mean for just our day-to-day life? So we're going to do our best to answer some of those questions today. We're going to start by giving a bit of background on these robots, and we'll also provide you with a few short demos so you can kind of see the software in action. We're then going to close the presentation with some discussion on the risks that are posed by ChatGPT and how to really be looking to harness AI and what the implications are for the workforce and some of the interesting legal responses that we've seen, not so much in Canada, but certainly in the US. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Luca, and he's going to start this presentation by giving you a bit of background on what exactly is this ChatGPT stuff anyway. Luca, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. So if we could get to the next slide, please, we'll get right into it. So I thought it would be helpful for us to spend a bit of time kind of just going under the hood and actually looking at what this technology does. So when we're talking about AI, we're talking about things that come in different flavors, and ChatGPT is one such flavor. That flavor is called a large language model and a natural language processing tool. Big fancy words, but you can boil its purpose down to a pretty simple task. Its job is to imitate intelligent speech and write like a human. How does it do this? So essentially, it's ingested a vast database consisting of most of the public internet, as well as the inputs that are provided to it in the course of using it. It then has been trained to predict, given a string of words or an input, what words are most likely to come next. And the way it does this is through a technique called machine learning, which is essentially an algorithm that builds a model to make decisions without explicitly being trained to make those decisions. So it takes this information in and has been trained by receiving feedback from human reviewers who basically told it, given it a reward model where by which certain outputs are rewarded as positive outputs, certain outputs are negative. And those rewards are essentially how successful was the output in imitating the intelligent author of a certain bit of text. That training is then used to further fine-tune the prediction process, which feeds back into the algorithm, and so forth and so on and so on. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in putting this presentation together, I'm going to use a few prompts that are actual inputs and outputs from ChatGPT to kind of demonstrate what it does and what it can't do, its strength and its limitations. So given the changing weather, I thought I'd task the system with a literary celebration of the warming weather, which you can see up on the screen here. So you can see what it's doing here. It's probably read every sonnet ever written. And on that basis, it has enough data to recognize that a sonnet is usually an expression of romantic feelings. It also understands what the specific rhyming structure of a sonnet is. And it also understands that Milton wrote sonnets in the Renaissance versus in the restoration of the form that took place in the Romantic period, and so understands the types of words that he would use. So you can see the output here. It's perhaps not as moving as the original, the genuine article, but it's a very elegant, persuasive imitation. Next slide, please. Now, here's a much simpler prompt, a deceptively simpler one, where I asked ChatGPT to essentially to tell me who of these two individuals is happy, and it struggles with it. You can see that this is a kind of intuitive thinking that humans can do, but somehow ChatGPT struggles with this type of reasoning. So if you go to the next slide, I asked it to break its thinking down step by step, and you can kind of see here that it kind of knows that Jack and Jill are sitting side by side. It knows that the person next to Jill is happy, but it doesn't know that Jack is happy. So you can see that there's the model is not trained to understand concepts as the way we understand them, or how those concepts kind of structurally relate to each other. It all exists on the language level. So this is the kind of thinking that's facile to the human mind, but an LLM has limitations with. And if you go to the next slide, please. Here's another example where ChatGPT struggles with a question about the relationship between Jack and Jill based on the fact that Jill is a college student and Jack is a college professor. So you can see there's a kind of struggle with the underlying conceptual relationship between the two entities, probably because ChatGPT has created an association around the word college and the fact that professors tend to be older than students. So the upshot of all this is, if you're thinking about deploying ChatGPT or any kind of other chatbot, you have to understand what it's designed to do, what its limitations are, and how the technology actually functions. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Here are a few kind of examples of NLP that are out there in the wild. The one we're talking about today is ChatGPT, which is the kind of chatbot par excellence, but there's also virtual assistants and other types of agents that can hold a conversation with an individual. And there's a few other kind of applications here as well. If we could run to the next slide, please. There's a separate flavor of AI that we're going to be talking about today, which is so-called automated decision-making. So like our friend natural language processing, this uses machine learning to learn patterns and relationships in data. Unlike our friend NLP, automated decision-making is designed to make assessments, judgments, and predictions, and ostensibly to improve the efficiency, speed, and accuracy of human decision-making through the use of those judgments. We can go to the next slide, please. This lists some of the kind of current applications of automated decision-making that are out there in the wild, and folks on this call may recognize quite a few of these. These are increasingly what we're seeing rolled out in the workforce, in the employment context. Fairly and increasingly common applications. So with that stage being set, I'll turn it over to Kirsten to kind of get into the next piece.
Thank you, Luca. So this is the exciting show and tell part where I'm going to actually show you with some prompts how this works. At least that's what I hope. As Luca's mentioned, the technologies are very unpredictable, so it's either going to do what I think it's going to do, or it's going to go badly off the rails. Rest assured you will be entertained either way. So I am going to share my screen. And what you should be seeing right now is the opening page of ChatGPT. So let's try ChatGPT. I always find this part amusing. I have to verify that I'm human. All right, very simple interface. You see the examples, capabilities, and limitations there, which no one reads, and then send a message. So we're going to give it a sporting chance here, and we are going to give it something it's very good at. So what we're going to do is tell it to draft an email to employees reminding them to be vigilant about phishing attempts. I'm sure everybody has either received one of those or drafted one. So here's what it puts together. The speed is pretty impressive. The accuracy, not bad. It reads a lot like all those emails you've received. So if you've never encountered ChatGPT before and you see this, you're thinking, well, this is going to make my job easier. And you're probably right. It's a tool. And that's the important piece to remember. It's a very powerful tool. For instance, we will now tell it, and we're sticking to the employment context here. Let's tell it to create a performance review matrix so that you can more easily provide feedback to your employees. So it's not bad. We've tried this a couple of times, and each time we've got a different type of matrix. But you can see that we're playing to the machine's strengths here. So here's something else to take a look at. So I'm just going to switch screens here. Here's a whole bunch of labor force statistics, lots and lots of labor force statistics. Hard to make any sense of it. If you're Andy, you love this stuff. I am not Andy. So we can point ChatGPT at that. And ask it to make sense of it for us. So here's the prompt. Summarize the employment labor trends over the last year using the data available here, and we provide the URL. Go ChatGPT. So it does a pretty good job of this too. So if you have any tedious reports you need to do, crunch numbers, wade through statistics, not bad. Now, I haven't checked these, and we'll come to that. I'm assuming that this is right. So far, they've had ChatGPT's done a pretty good job demonstrating what it can do. Luke has given you examples of what it's not so great at. Here's another example of what it's not. It is not predictive AI. So even though I can point it at historical data and ask it to provide an estimate of the odds of the Toronto Maple Leafs winning the Stanley Cup this season, it generally balks at that. So this is the sort of close but no cigar. You see it's regurgitating information, but it's not doing what you asked it to do. Why? It can't do what you asked it to do. So these have been a lot of parlor tricks. Now, what I want to show you is something else that's useful. We're going to go out of ChatGPT and on to something else. This is called Tome. It's basically ChatGPT for PowerPoints. And I can hear everybody getting excited right now because nobody likes doing these things. This drafts them. And it does a pretty good job, assuming it works this out. There we go. Okay. So it gives you pre-prepared templates. We are going to, let's pick an all hands one. We hit create. And how about we create presentation on, let's go into what I know, privacy law in Canada. Sounds good so far. So far, pretty good. We've got an agenda. Okay, great. Where it kind of goes a little creepy is on the art. So you get nice graphics, but these are AI generated graphics. So here we've got all the right number of fingers. Sometimes it doesn't quite get that right. You'll see it does strange things with words. It knows there's supposed to be words, but it doesn't really know what words are. And that person is looking a little suspect, especially around the hands. Not really sure what that's supposed to be. Not bad. Once again, we have the word problem. And something weird with the hands. Doesn't do hands very well. Abstract, I think that's a globe, maybe North America, South America. And the universal lock, which shows up in all of these things. So that gives you a good background to what this thing is, what it can do and what it can't do. It's important to remember it's just a tool. And if, like any other tool, it's got strengths and it's got weaknesses. So in light of that, what do you need to be concerned about? We're going to go through now all the various types of things to be thinking about. Over to you, Luca.
Thanks, Kirsten. If we could get on to the next slide, please. The first thing is about essentially a problem about what goes in and what comes out of ChatGPT. So remember our explanation of how this thing works. Language goes in, language goes out. The issue here is that once language goes in, it comes back out in unexpected ways, and the language that you put in, you may not want coming out. So we've started to see a few examples of this out in the field related to disciplines like computer programming, as you might expect. ChatGPT and other generative AI tools are very adept at assembling code for programmers. Sounds great. Stick in your code, get some code out. The issue we've noticed is that it's been reported that people are starting to see their code spat back out at them. And that's code that is ostensibly proprietary, confidential. So kind of important thing to note here is that if whatever you put in to the model gets incorporated into that algorithmic process and gets subsequently spat out. Now, from a legal perspective, OpenAI, the owner and operator of ChatGPT, has covered itself in its terms and use, whereby you agree to any information going into the model to be used for development and improvement of services. Note also on this slide the difficulty in making any claims. For one, the paltry liability cap, as well as the fact that the general use contract is directly with the employee, not the business. So the employer would have difficulty bringing a claim against OpenAI in relation to any kind of provision of confidential information into the model. So the upshot here is, as a policy solution, make sure that employees know about the uncertainty of how prompts may be handled, and certainly prohibit the use of personal information or client or confidential information in those prompts. Now, there's a late-breaking development, which is that just a few days ago, OpenAI announced that they're introducing an opt-out whereby users can opt out of the use of their inputs for training of the model. So remains to be seen kind of what the scope of that looks like. But if, assuming that that is the case, then this would certainly be recommended as a supplement to any the policy that we're talking about here. Over to you, Kirsten.
All right, on to the next slide, please. So as lovely as ChatGPT is, it sometimes gets things wrong. ChatGPT can only generate content based on what it's been trained on. So if you look through the fine print there, it's not very good at anything past 2021 because that's when it was trained. So anything that's happened in the world since then, it doesn't really recognize or even understand exists. It's also a victim of what its settings are. And you can, like when you're doing searches, you can do broad searches or specific searches. It's very, very similar about how conservative or creative the output would be. If you have broad parameters, you're going to get nonsensical output. If you have too conservative parameters, you're going to get very, very literal output. So the trick is finding somewhere in the middle. All of that is built into the machine. You don't have any control over that. What you do have control over is the prompt. And there's a whole cottage industry that has apparently sprung up in generating prompts. You can buy prompts, you can sell prompts, you can hire people to craft prompts. They're very good at sort of towing that middle line of getting what you want, particularly in some of the visual art type generators, not so much in the text. The problem is if you don't have any framework for benchmarking that quality of the input and the accuracy of the output is then going to be a leap of faith. You don't know if what you're getting is any good. It's just based on whatever went into the machine. You don't know what went into the machine. You don't really know how good it is. What that means is then, and we've seen some of this, you shouldn't be using that output unless it's reviewed by someone who actually knows something. So think of ChatGPT as a somewhat dim child who needs guidance of an expert. They get things right sometimes, but not always. So if you have a policy, and you probably should start thinking about that, you need to have two types of review on it. One is an AI review. So somebody who knows something about the technology, who's saying, yeah, the inputs are good, the outputs are good, mechanics of this thing actually work. It's set up to do what we want it to do. And then a subject matter expert review. So in the case of that privacy PowerPoint you saw me generate, that would be someone like me or Luca going through it and going, yep, okay, they did a pretty good job of this, or whoa, I don't know what that is. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, ChatGPT, and not only does it get things wrong, it outright lies. And these are being called hallucinations. So you see a series of prompts here where I asked it to outline Canadian legal issues arising from the use of ChatGPT in the financial services sector. And I was very specific here. I wanted it to mention any pending or existing court cases globally that support the points it was going to make. And I wanted ChatGPT to include hyperlinks. So it provided what I needed. And then at the end, it said, oh, banks can be held liable for any harm or damages. Okay, that's news to me. I haven't seen anything yet. And then it pointed to this court case in the UK, Dunn versus National Westminster Bank. Oh, okay, well, I wasn't aware of that one. So I asked it to provide the hyperlink, and it provided the hyperlink just as asked. I clicked the hyperlink. It went nowhere. It did go to Bailey, which is like Canley. It's a database, but it entirely made up that link. And I thrashed through the internet trying to find any reference to Dunn and National Westminster Bank. I Googled it. I looked at it. I did what I could. I could not find it. Interestingly enough, I concluded I was wrong and not the machine. So then I went back to it and said, okay, is this a real case? And then it doubled down on its lie. Yeah, said absolutely a real case. It was heard at this time by this court at this date. And you can find it on this website. And I said, okay, well, I've already tried finding it on the website. I can't. Then I started to suspect it made this case up. So I put it to it. I call it on its lie. Did you make the case up? Nope, it did not make the case up. And it, again, doubled down on it, telling me that not only was it there, I could find it on Bailey, which was reliable. And I thought, okay, I'm not getting anywhere with this. Maybe there's a blog post on this case. At this point, I'm still doubting my own sanity and thinking that this machine might be suspect, but it's probably right. So then I'd find a blog post on this case by a reputable UK firm. And I thought, okay, maybe I've just missed something. Nope, blog post was made up. The link points nowhere. So you can get into a pretty good fight with ChatGPT and it will consistently double down on its lies. And you have no way of knowing that. So bear that in mind when we talk through some of these issues. Next slide, please. So this one, to the extent that you've been following news about ChatGPT and generative AI, you may have seen this one hit the news. So one of the big issues in artificial intelligence, no matter what type is being used, is the bias. Some are more egregious than others. We'd like to think that you can train the biases out of AI, but AI ultimately does what it does based on its training, and it's trained on real world data. So if you train something on real world data, not only are you importing all the data, you're importing all the biases and things that are pre-existing in that data. You can then try and adjust the AI algorithm to weed those sorts of things out. And you saw when I tried to get it to predict about the Maple Leafs, it just sort of backed down and said, nope, can't do that, not meant to do that, and then provided an alternative. If you ask ChatGPT various offensive questions, such as do men or women make better employees, it starts to reprimand you about how that's not a question that's appropriate, it's not programmed to answer that, and then it steers you off in another direction. And that's some of the rules. And the rules are very consistent. I've been trying to work around them for a couple of weeks now and haven't had a lot of success. But as a result of that, it's now coming under criticism for being what in the common parlance is called being a little too woke. And I've got a quote there from Elon Musk, who was apparently finding the same issue. I take no position on this. I think it's very interesting. OpenAI itself has set itself up to be a developer of fair and unbiased AI. So, of course, it's going to steer that way. Without those filters, the AI will do what the AI does. It will likely double down on the types of biases, because by the sheer repetition of the various iterations, any emphasis on biases or inequalities tend to get magnified. What does this mean for employers? Well, if you're using this kind of thing, you have to be aware of that. In particular, if there are individuals that are entering these kinds of things. Now, I said ChatGPT seems to have pretty good filters on it, but there's a lot of other AI bots out there that don't. So if you're communicating this, or your employees are communicating this to others, either throughout the organization or into the world, an employer may find itself vicariously liable. And this has come up a few times where the marketing team has been replaced by ChatGPT or similar AI bots with one person supervising the output. The AI tends to run amok on that. So a human in the loop here's probably a good idea. In fact, a couple humans in the loop, just to see what's going out into the world. Once again, we get back to that need for review, not only with a technical expert who understands, what's going into the machine and how it works, but a subject matter expert. Next slide. So the challenge, and this is a risk I took when I showed you that demonstration, ChatGPT doesn't always generate the same output to the same or similar prompts, which makes it a bit of a crapshoot. You don't know what you're going to get. An example there is two separate prompts, so same prompt and two separate outputs. So draft a one-paragraph summary of Canadian employment law. It drafted it twice, and it wasn't quite the same. It's close, and both are accurate. Andy can correct me on the employment law niceties. But because of that, you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. And you can't assume that just because you've entered the prompt once, what you're going to get the second time or the third time or the 15th time is also going to be good. So that consistency is lacking. And we've already pointed to some of the issues around accuracy, and for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if you're going to develop a ChatGPT, and immediately, of course, people subvert it for the plagiarism and copying and shortcutting things, now there are tools available to detect AI-generated content. There seems to be a whole cottage industry around that too. Those tools, not great. But something to remember, and if you have employees that are using this, either sanctioned or unsanctioned, is to make sure employees understand that others may be able to tell if something is AI generated and not human generated. And there's a risk in certain industries, particularly, where a failure to make that clear or an outright misrepresentation can land you in trouble. If there's an expectation that it's human generated, it may be just safer to be transparent about ChatGPT use. The risk there is largely reputational at this point, although there's some pending lawsuits about that sort of thing. Next slide, please. The other question is, what about this non-human creation? Who gets to own that? Is it OpenAI? Is it the person who entered the prompt? Is it the machine? Right now, by virtue of contract, OpenAI assigns all rights in output to the user. So everything that thing generates gives you, the user, the right, although there's a part of those rights are sliced off for OpenAI for improving its services. Now, in some jurisdictions, there is no copyright for non-human authored content. So that's going to make enforcing any rights against third parties more difficult. So if you have employees that are entering things into ChatGPT or other similar bots and producing content, and it's something that you want to be able to claim copyright or some proprietary rights in, you may have a problem there. And the first big popular issue of this was South Park, where Trey Parker, one of the creators of South Park, created an episode in conjunction with ChatGPT, and ChatGPT was actually the focus of that. And I've got some screen grabs there. But it's an open question about whether there's copyright available in that. Again, that's a jurisdictional question, so you'll need to understand not just the law, but the law where you are. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Kirsten. So just dovetailing all of that, and we had a quick question in the chat about this, so I'm glad we're addressing it, which is a question about copyright issues related to the use of ChatGPT or other generative platforms, including those that generate images. You'll see the screen cap up here, which is a set of images that were generated likely from prompts that were asking the machine to, do a portrait of me like I'm a superhero. So, again, the generative models, including image generators, are all entirely contingent on their training data. That training data certainly includes copyrighted works, just given the volume of data that's been hoovered up from the internet, that's a surety. So naturally, the outputs of your prompts are going to resemble those copyrighted works. So the corollary of that is that by creating prompts and creating outputs from those prompts that use copyrighted material, you're getting into the territory where you're generating outputs that may be similar or even identical to the training works. And you can see that in the example here, where we've got a couple of Wonder Womans, we've got the Superman S on the chest, etc. Now, the question, of course, then becomes, well, how close do you need to be for that generated output to constitute copyright infringement? We don't have case law on that point yet, but we can expect that this is going to be a live issue moving forward. On the input side, we're also seeing legal action with respect to the use of the input data. So, for example, right now there's a high-profile lawsuit that's been brought by Getty Images against a company called Stability AI for the use of training images in its library. Unhelpfully to Stability AI, the reproductions that were outputted from the system also included the Getty Images watermark, which is kind of a dead ringer for the source of the information. So we expect to see a lot of action on that side, on the input side. Now, as the practical upshot of this is, if you're using these kinds of systems and the output's going to be valuable, it's going to be widely reproduced or disseminated, you're kind of have to be aware of potential IP infringement risk. So if we're talking about prompts and the use of outputs that could constitute copyrighted information, then you're going to want to ensure that your employees declare whether the output is generated by AI so that you can assess and evaluate that type of risk before you're involved in any kind of publication or dissemination of the material that could potentially get you into potential infringement. Next slide, please. I'll hand it back to Kirsten.
Thanks, Luca. So the intellectual property issues, both on the input side and the output side, are significant. And we've seen not just with ChatGPT and the Getty Images Stability AI issues, but you may have seen some recent headlines about the generation of music using arguably sampled sounds. So you can generate your own Drake sound. This has got the music studios sort of reeling, trying to figure out exactly what is or isn't covered by intellectual property rights and licensing rights and so on and so forth. Another artist has just come out and said, hey, feel free to use my voice, see what you can do with it. So it's getting very interesting very quickly. And that's one of the things I'd like to emphasize. The speed of this technology is unlike anything I've ever seen. I've worked in this area for 20 years. I've been around for all the technological inventions. I had a Palm Pilot way back in the day. Pretty proud of that. Still have it. Don't use it. But ChatGPT was released publicly mid-November 2022. And here we are. We're having conversations about AI and its workplace applications, and companies are buying and selling this stuff months later. The consequence of that is trying to keep up with it. So in addition to the intellectual property issues that this thing creates, it's also got some privacy or data protection issues. The first data protection authority to grapple this was the Italian Data Protection Authority. And that data protection authority is under the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It had considered what ChatGPT was doing and moved very quickly to temporarily ban ChatGPT. And that was, at least in Italy, and that was in part because it determined that individuals hadn't been given any notice about how their information was going to be hoovered up in the training data set. And the GDPR works differently than Canadian legislation. We work on a consent model. Under the GDPR, there has to be a lawful basis, and that can be contract, it can be some sort of other lawful basis. And ChatGPT was unable to point to the lawful basis for it doing this. So until they've resolved that with the Data Protection Authority, ChatGPT is no longer available in Italy. All the regulators talk to one another. So not surprisingly, the Canadian Privacy Commissioner recently launched a similar investigation at the beginning of the month, based on different legal grounds, but same kind of idea that individuals ought to have been given notice or potentially actually expressly consented to having their information hoovered up into the training set. And there's actually a website, if you think your information has been used, you can actually go to this website, identify who you are, and see if your information was included in the ChatGPT training set. The other issue around this is AI models have consistently been proven to be really, really good at figuring out who you are, even when information is de-identified. This makes the question about whether de-identification and particularly whether you can actually ever anonymize anything is a live issue. The Privacy Commissioner of Canada takes a dim view and has stated its position in several blogs that it doesn't think anonymization, in light of the computing power that we have, is even really possible. This has found its way into the pending privacy legislation, draft Bill C-27, big debate about whether anonymized information should be within the scope of the legislation or not. There's a very, very high, currently as drafted, a very, very high bar to anonymization. But in de-identified information, where name is removed or other sort of location identifiers or things like that, typically AI can stitch it all back together pretty quickly. So the important piece on that, and this isn't really an employment-related issue, but another sidebar issue, and that is if you're drafting contracts, you'll want to make sure you have fairly robust prohibitions against re-identification. Think about this in the context of third-party providers for diversity and inclusion questionnaires and things like that. You may want to take a very close look at some of that language. Another piece that you should be thinking about while you're doing this is if you're going to do this within on an enterprise level, consider the use cases that you are going to use this for and make sure they're justified. Data protection or impact assessments are generally a good idea. In terms of a policy position, your policy should probably say not only don't put confidential and proprietary information into these things, but prohibit making queries about individuals. ChatGPT won't let you do that. Other bots are not as woke as ChatGPT. They will allow pretty much anything. ChatGPT is the current darling, but there are other mechanisms out there. So if your employees are using this, if you are using it on an enterprise level, you'll likely want to prohibit the use of personal information or queries about individuals via that bot. Next slide, please. Explainability. This is becoming an increasing requirement of the law, and you've now sat here for 40 minutes, so you should be able to explain this technology easily. If that makes you shrug and scratch your head, then you sort of sympathize with people trying to explain how this stuff works. So OpenAI offers a pretty general explanation of how ChatGPT was trained, how it's used, and what it can be used for. However, at its core, ChatGPT and all these other bots and AI functionalities out there are a proprietary technology. So given that they're proprietary, the creators of them are not going to be fully transparent as to what this thing is actually using, what code it's used, what the parameters are, or how the model works. That's entirely reasonable. That's how you protect your patent rights or your copyright rights in a proprietary technology. However, we run up against a lot of privacy laws or focused artificial intelligence laws, and those generally require or will require in some form or other, where the application is used to make decisions about individuals that have a significant impact. The organization that's using that AI needs to provide an explanation. Typically, it consists of how the thing works, what factors or personal information are being taken into account in whatever that output is, how you protect against bias and inaccuracy risks, either internally within the organization or at the machine level. And these legislation or laws usually provide some sort of right to contest or complain about the decision with some human. Sometimes you can insist that the decision be made by a human. In other cases, like the new Quebec law, it's simply a right to register a complaint around the automated decision making. So other than trying to figure out what this means, if you're engaging in the purchase, acquisition, or use of these technologies, you will probably want to press on the vendor how this works and get some sort of explainability. Many vendors, a surprising number of vendors, will not be able to explain how this technology works. This technology is pretty easily available on GitHub, or at least portions of it are. So on an open source basis, all of this can be assembled to make something with many of its creators, particularly smaller creators, not fully understanding how it was trained, what the training data set was, what the biases are, or how actually it uses. And I've been involved in a couple of cases where that's been the case. You can't turn around when you get in trouble and go to your vendor and say, okay, now tell us how it works. If it's a small vendor or an unsophisticated vendor, you're likely just to get a shrug. This, if you're doing this right, you should catch all of it in a data protection impact assessment. And it's not yet required in Canada. It's required elsewhere, but it's generally a best practice. So before you consider adopting this stuff, think about doing a protection impact assessment. We do them all the time, not only on this technology, but on other types of technologies. And then consider having a larger, if you're going to use AI on any scale, have an enterprise-wide AI impact assessment program, which is separate from a discrete data protection impact assessment. Next slide, please. Andy, over to you.
Great. So thanks, Luca and Kirsten, for providing so much of a overview and demonstration of where we are with the AI. And we've got a number of questions that we're going to try and get to. But before we do, let's look at the HR space in the workplace. If you go to the next slide, one of the questions that was posed was, well, where is AI being used right now in an HR context? And this is a survey that was done by the Society of Human Resource Management. So it's an American survey. And this was last year. So this was kind of pre the explosion of ChatGPT. So it's entirely possible that there's actually more uses and more businesses that are using it. But the primary area where this type of AI is being used, and you heard the difference as well between generative, predictive AI, but just in terms of just basic AI, recruitment and hiring is the most common area. Haven't really seen anything in sort of like promotion decisions or predictive type AI. And obviously there are some big concerns about bias and discrimination, which we briefly touched on and we'll discuss a bit more. So what has been the legal response? If you go to the next slide, and Kirsten touched on this, just on how fast this technology is coming. There are currently no Canadian laws that are specifically addressing the use of AI in employment law decisions. There's been a number of amendments, as you all know, to the Employment Standards Act, at least in Ontario. None of them have touched on this type of an issue. Similarly, the Human Rights Code has not been updated in any way to reflect these types of issues. Part of it will be that you don't necessarily need the government to step in and provide an update on the human rights legislation across this country, because if there's an employment aspect to any sort of decision or context, any sort of matter, the human rights codes of Canada and the provinces, they will apply. And so we just have to ensure that if you are using AI, that you are going to do your best to make sure that they are not going to be predisposed to one particular type of result that would disadvantage some sort of group that identifies with a protected ground. So that kind of is a good place to look at what's happening in the US. And on the next slide, you'll see that there's no federal laws that specifically address the use of AI in employment law decisions, but there are some state and local laws that have been passed, and there's some in California, but the one that's gotten the most amount of notoriety is this New York City local law 144. And it is intended to be live or enforceable or effective in the summer of this year. And what it does is it regulates the use of AI-driven hiring tools. So the law limits employees or employment agencies from using an automated employment decision tool to make an employment decision unless the tool is audited for bias annually, the employer publishes a public summary of the audit, and the employer provides certain notices to applicants and employees who are subject to the screening by the tool. So the law then provides some guidance as to what this bias audit needs to look like. It also provides some basics as to what the summary needs to look like. And I think as we go forward, this is the type of legislative response that we can likely anticipate in Canada. Because as you saw on the very first slide of this segment of the presentation, over 70% of the people who are using AI in employment law decisions are using them in recruitment. And so that is going to be kind of a critical area to ensure that there's some sort of check and balance on the tool to ensure that it's fair. And that's going to be something that I think Canada will likely look to other jurisdictions to see what the legislative response has been. So far it's been muted, but this I think is a good example of what is likely coming in the next, maybe not this year, but as AI becomes more and more prevalent in the workplace, certainly something that governments will be talking about in elections and potentially with a legislative response in 2024. So where does that leave you as an employer? If we look briefly at the next slide, talking about a workplace AI policy, and we're going to get into some of your questions momentarily. And one thing Kirsten said to Luca and I, when we were kind of first putting this presentation together, one of the threshold decisions that employers need to make is, well, what do you think about this? Is it your friend or is it your enemy? And if it's your friend, well, what are we going to do to find out how our employees can use it in a way that's constructive to our business and doesn't open ourselves up for risk? And when you're developing a policy like this, certainly you need to look at the legal aspects and the HR aspects, but you also need to make sure that you look at the actual machining and the AI expert at your organization to review this. And so some basic elements, and I'll turn it over to Kirsten to kind of address some things after this. You want to make sure there are some limitations and very clear prohibitions on providing confidential business information to the bot, because you don't want that type of information to then be available to your competitors or just the public at large. You want to make sure that there are strict rules on what you can use it for. Kirsten was talking about, not entering in personal information of other employees or other people who the employee might be dealing with on a day-to-day business as part of the business. Do we need to provide some sort of training on this? And when you roll this policy out, it's probably going to be even more important than other policies that you have training, because, do people know that they shouldn't treat people badly and that we need to treat people with respect? Yes. And of course, we train people on the policy and making sure that they understand how to report a complaint and how to investigate. But here you may be starting from the very, very basic of, well, what is this AI and where is it on my system and what should it be used for? And why is it dangerous? And why is it beneficial? You might have to have much more of a robust kind of education portion to your training beyond simply that, and here's our policy and this is how you need to follow it. And the last thing is, in your policy on the use of AI, there should be something about a requirement for human review. As you will have seen during the course of the presentation, whether it was through Kirsten's demos or Luca's examples with Jack and Jill, AI is not perfect. And so we can't be just pawning this information off or these finished products off on the assumption that it's perfect because a robot or a computer did it. Kirsten, is there anything you wanted to cover on this before we start getting into the more general Q&A?
Sure. Just what I want to pick up on a point that you mentioned, and that is this friend or foe? You are certainly free to decide this is your foe and ban it from your workplace. And there's all sorts of ways to do that. But anybody who has a teenager know that that's just an invitation for everyone to go around it. I've already witnessed this in the context of the schools, which have banned ChatGPT, and all the kids are just simply doing it on their phones and then cut and pasting it into whatever their documents are. I have no reason to think that employees wouldn't do the same thing. So your better approach may be to do exactly what you say here, training, highlight the risks, and then use a disclosure policy. If people are going to use it, then they should be telling you that they're using it or disclosing that they're using it so that there's an opportunity for that review. And it's that missed opportunity for review is really where the danger is. And then I also want to take the opportunity to bridge a gap here. So we've largely been talking about generative AI, and that's what you see in the context of ChatGPT and the like, that PowerPoint. Mostly what you get in current HR applications is the type of AI review that screens out resumes. It does a task for you. It's not necessarily generative. You may, however, be using generative AI and not even realize it. We just recently moved over to Microsoft 365 in the cloud, and as part of that update, our Outlook was updated, and now we have these little prompts. So when you get an email, instead of actually drafting your own prompt, you can hit a thing that says, yes, thanks, or absolutely, or good point, or whatever the prompt is. That's an AI-generated prompt. So there's an AI function embedded in that software. What you need to be aware of when you are using HR software or other software is that you may be using AI, or your vendor may be using AI, and you may not be aware of it. So you should be asking vendors of these software, particularly career pathing, recruitment software, diversity, equity, inclusion types of software. Ask them questions about that. And if you get a shrug or a confused look, you may want to press further. And the reason is, it helps you manage risk if you're aware of the risk, and you may have a disclosure obligation, either under existing or pending privacy laws or employment laws. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we've got a million questions.
Yeah, we're going to run out of time, but before we get to the questions, one thing that we are in the process of finalizing is the development of a template AI policy. For those of you who have worked with us in the past, you know that we try to make things easy by kind of anticipating the policies that you need in your workplace and offering them for a flat fee. We're going to be doing the same thing with generative AI. And so if you are interested, there's going to be, and I think there's going to be something that's going to be put in the chat right now by Peggy with an email address. You can email that address and just say that you're interested in getting a copy of that policy. And again, it's going to be for a flat fee, and we can provide you with the details once you provide the email to the address that's in the chat right now. So in terms of questions, I'm going to go to you, Kirsten, on this first one. In regards to the to explainability, does this apply to devices or systems that includes AI capacity? For example, a GPS device with AI capability to detect human driving behavior.
Yeah, this is it depends. It depends what jurisdiction you're in and what laws govern. Currently in Canada, there is no disclosure obligation about the AI itself. It might be using personal information, in which case you may have to disclose that in either a privacy policy or a consent process. But right now, no. However, we're seeing in Quebec in September, and if Bill C-27 passes, probably in the coming years here, there will be a positive obligation to disclose this. And then if the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act passes as part of Bill C-27, there would also be some restrictions about what you can and can't do and how you have to manage it and document all of that. That is for types of systems. So if it's a system with a significant impact. And it also talks about the distinction between a developer of these things, a user, or sort of a custodian, or somebody who is responsible for the AI. The legislation currently in Canada is a bit opaque on this point. It's a draft. It's really nothing more than a framework. Most of the meat will be left to the regulations, and that won't happen until the law is actually passed. So right now, no obligations in Canada except around privacy, but you should probably be thinking about this.
Great, thanks so much. Now, there was a question, Luca, about where someone is just kind of willingly putting stuff on the internet is that being hoovered up by AI as well? Like, so for example, people have put their job information on LinkedIn. Is that going to be now used by software like ChatGPT?
So I can't speak to the specific example of LinkedIn, but we do know that it's a lot of information that's available online is fair game. OpenAI, for its own part, has not revealed the source of its own training set, but there have been some publications as of late that have kind of done an analysis of the different types of training sources that have been used to train various other LLMs, like Google's T5, Facebook's got one called LLAMA, and essentially it's essentially a fairly vast kind of sample of the internet, right? So it's hard to say without full disclosure from the entities that are involved in hoovering up all the data, but it's getting increasingly likely that information about an individual that's online may very well be used in training data. And I can circulate that article in the chat afterwards, as it might be of interest to the person who asked that question and others, and certainly illuminating in terms of the scale of data that's being processed.
The other point to remember on this sort of thing too is that notwithstanding the fact that these companies and the AI are going around hoovering up all the information, it's usually a violation of the terms of use of these social media sites and LinkedIn. That hasn't stopped anybody yet, and all that will do is really end up in a bun fight between the LinkedIns of the world or the Instagrams of the world and whichever company is hoovering them up. We do have some visibility into this. If you remember the Clearview AI case, as a consequence of the multiple investigations into that, it openly acknowledged that it was going around pulling off, in that case, it was a facial recognition technology. So it was pulling off the faces from company websites like Denton's, things posted to Facebook, things posted to LinkedIn. So if your face may well be already in that data set.
All right, well, let's see if we can squeeze maybe one more question here in. And this is something that Kirsten and Luca, we spoke about very briefly. What is the obligation to disclose to a client that you are internally using AI to either provide their service or work on something? And I know, Kirsten, you talked about a case involving some financial professionals.
Yeah, and right now it doesn't seem like there is any obligation to disclose anything. It doesn't seem to be any different than if I have one of my associates draft something and then I send to a client. But what's happening, it's the inaccuracy that is now starting to trip companies up. And there was a company that wrote, it was an online financial news type thing, and they basically got rid of all their staff and had a ChatGPT-like AI draft financial advice columns. Some astute person went back through all the columns, discovered that things like compound interest and basic math had been gotten wrong, and the company suffered significant reputational damage and then had to sort of backtrack on that. So it's an interest, and they had not disclosed that it was being written by AI. There was, if you clicked through the byline and a couple of other pages, there was a reference that it was supported with AI, but not explicitly, and it was hard to find. Currently in Canada, no obligation to disclose this, but it does raise a very interesting question about misrepresentation and whether or not a failure to disclose this is material and whether it amounts to a misrepresentation. If you are in a regulated profession, the threshold is likely a little more strict, so you want to be paying attention to that. Now, having said that, the various regulatory bodies and colleges move at the speed of molasses in January, so I'm not expecting to see any guidance on this in the near future. To the extent somebody jumps on this, I would expect it to be one of the financial services regulatory bodies.
Well, look, that takes us to 1 o'clock. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us, and Kirsten and Luca, a big thank you to you. You're always such great friends of the employment group to volunteer your services and provide such interesting insights. A word to all of you. Our next webinar is on Friday, May 26th. And we know that this is a very important area that applies to all workplaces. Anecdotally, from a registration standpoint, this will be the highest attended and highest registered event since we started doing these, and the only other event that was had more people register for it was the day after the WHO had declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic. So you know that this is something that is now taking over the workforce with this level of interest. So remember about the policy. If you are interested in it, by all means, please do send an email either to the address that's in the chat or to the dentist lawyer that you work most regularly with. And otherwise, thanks to everyone for joining. Have a great weekend, and we will see you next month.